It was perfect timing to read your essay because it touched on a lot of the things we've been reading. And I guess I was curious about talking a little bit more about the history of iconoclasm.
Yeah, I read up on it some years ago, and it struck me that there's two ways to deal with this problematic or problem or question of the image, and one is to destroy it, to smash it. And I don't consider this to be a stupid, brutal solution either. In fact, the iconoclasts were exceedingly subtle in their critique. Their idea was that only the Eucharist could be, only the bread and wine could be the true image of God in the flesh, because it was the flesh. It literally was, because of transubstantiation. So anything else could only stand in the way of the individual's experience of the divine presence. So, therefore, these icons were distractions at best, and satanic delusions at worst. And I mean, that's a kind of subtle approach. You're not just saying, picture bad, kill picture. They had a very deep and profound reason for this dislike of the image, I think. There's a book, I don't know if have you all read it? It's called The Horus, The Limits?
No, but it was really interesting to see reference to that in your essay.
I forget now. The story is that all the iconoclastic texts were destroyed, except one, and it was quoted line for line in the attack on the iconoclasts in their trial, so to speak, in the conclave that was held to denounce them. And in order to denounce them, this really, this clever ideological commissar quoted it line by line and then refuted it, or he thought he refuted it.
Yeah.
In fact, his arguments are sometimes very inadequate, I thought. The whole thing is that, first of all, Christianity starts as Judaism, and Judaism doesn't have images, or it doesn't admit that it has images. Of course, that's already a problem, because you have the Ark of the Covenant with the two angels and so forth and so on. But anyway, in theory, no image of God, and by extension, no image of anything. So the Christianity starts as a branch of Judaism, and therefore it starts without images, almost virtually without images. And it's not until the first, most scholars say it's the 2nd century before there's any images at all. Actually, it's earlier than that, but let's say that's the truth. That officially the first Christian images are the pictures in the catacombs in Rome. It's already 200 years later. So Buddhism also begins without images for several hundred years. There's something about the immediacy of the divine experience that wants to not be mediated by images, and more than one tradition. And then, so meanwhile, they're criticizing the pagans for their images and saying, that this is diabolical. And the Emperor Julian, the apostate, you all heard of him, right? He comes along in the early 4th century, the middle of the 4th century. He's the last gasp of paganism. And he uses Neoplatonism as an excuse, or as a apologia for the image. In other words, we don't mistake the image for the thing. That's foolish. The Christians are wrong when they say this about us. It's a support for contemplation. It reminds us, to contemplate the divine. Suddenly, in the 3rd or 4th century, or 100 or so years later, the Christians are using the same argument that Julian used against the iconoclasts. No, we don't believe that the icon is actually that God is living in the painting. How could you ever say such a thing? It's a form of contemplation. It's a form for contemplation. And they're even quoting, the Neoplatonists. So there's been a 180-degree switch there. Not the first time it happens in an ideological history, that such a turnaround occurs. But it's very mysterious how it happened. Nobody really knows who was the first to do this and why it was done, except that they wanted pictures and they had to have an excuse for it. And the iconoclasts didn't like this at all. They thought this was hypocrisy and wrong. So then, of course, there's the fact that Islam is rising up at the same time, right next door to Byzantium, and they've got this strong critique of pictures. So there clearly was some influence back and forth there. And so the whole thing is very, very complex, and it's not this kind of barbaric smashing, this, vandalism
Heathen
thing.
hordes just
Yeah,
destroying.
not that the Vandals were as bad as they're painted either, but never mind. I kind of like the Vandals. But then the next round of this would be, the next big attempt to do this would be Protestantism. And you had the Cromwellians smashing the altars and breaking the stained glass windows and everything. And frankly, I find it horrifying, destroying all that great art and everything. It's what they did to art in England is unspeakable. Music, everything, just total collapse for 50 years.
Would you consider?
But there were real reasons for it. There were deep, mystical, important reasons for why they were doing what. Not that every single Cromwellian soldier who was pissing on the altar understood those reasons, but the reasons did exist. So I think we have to take this into consideration, that one way to free ourselves up from, the slavery to advertising and propaganda and image spinning that we're all woven into in our culture is to break through it, to smash it. That could be a possible solution. Try to live as much as possible without images. Could that be done, do you think? Would you even want to do it? I mean, you guys are all into art. It would be kind of horrifying for you to think about this, right? I presume.
I was wondering if you would consider non-representational painting, abstraction, and Greenberg another version of this, because the way he wrote in his essay on kitsch how kitsch could be manipulated by fascists, whereas non-representational painting could not be corrupted.
Two things immediately spring to my mind. One is that did you ever see that book about the CIA and abstract expressionism?
On
What's it
Serge
called?
Guilbeault, how New York stole the idea of modern art.
No.
How he supported it?
Yes.
Secret supporters.
The CIA supported the whole abstract expressions
Yeah.
movement
Yeah, I remember.
for the reason that it had as far as they were concerned, it had no content. So it was ideologically neutral. And it could be presented as a great, exciting, modern, America suddenly launches itself into the sphere of the avant-garde, but it didn't say anything. It didn't say become a communist specifically. It was not social realism or even expressionism, That's the first thing that occurs to me. The second thing is that a much stronger argument along these lines would be the argument in Islam. So-called abstract art in Islam. Is it really abstract? No. It has to do with pattern and form, inner form, the structure of vision itself, as opposed to specific content of vision. The crystalline forms that you see in the architecture, the calligraphy, the forms of the letters themselves is very important. It's calligraphy in Islam is the central art, not pictures, but writing itself is the central art, and so the letters themselves become exceedingly beautiful. It's as if they're making up for having to do without pictures by emphasizing, by creating this, exquisite so-called abstract. I don't like the word abstract in connection with it so much. I wish there was a better term. I don't know what to call it. So from that point of view, yeah, he was onto something. It's not just kitsch that can be taken. I mean, geez, look at the Catholic Church. Probably the most authoritarian authority that's ever existed in Western culture, and the art is great. Come on, you're not going to tell me that's kitsch. No, now, yeah, since Vatican II, but in the Renaissance, in the Middle Ages, come on, this was the thin edge of the wedge. It's great. Art, the greatest of all art can still have an ideological use. I think that, actually Benjamin would have agreed with this. But as he pointed out, you have to put a caption on it. The image by itself it can't do the ideological job. It's something else. It's doing something else. Maybe we could call it aesthetics. But when you put a caption on it, then you can ideologize the image. So this is why you see in Islamic manuscripts, you see the picture and then there's words. This is why in manuscripts, monastic manuscripts in the Middle Ages, you see the illumination and the little pictures and the capital letters and so forth, and then you see the writing. So what they're doing is it's a form of captioning of the image, or imaging of the imaging of the writing. It works both ways. In essence, I would say that by now, abstract expressionism itself has an ideological meaning. It didn't, perhaps, as far as the CIA was concerned, it was neutral. But now it definitely means something. It's what? It's the ideology of a lost modernism, which many people are still nostalgic about and are trying to reinvent.
I also wonder,
And so it brings the whole baggage of modernism with a capital M with it,
in response to your question too about whether we could live without images, I wonder if it plays a role, because there's so much. There seems to be a renewed interest in abstraction.
Yes, there definitely does. Perhaps you're saying that this is because of a certain sickening quality of the image. Yeah, it could be. What do you think about that? That's an interesting point. I never thought about that, but it's probably true.
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying to write about it a little bit recently, and that's one side of it, that we're deluged with images on the screen, and that makes, the kind of looking that goes on with abstract painting is very different than that. So, and it's made this hunger for it, actually being in the body and moving around in the body. So the screen has set this up. But I wanted to ask something about you. This is a big point about that the image by itself can't really do the ideological job. That's why it needs caption, or it needs words. But can you talk, what is the image doing? That's
what is it doing by itself, you mean?
That's what we've been talking and thinking about a lot.
Yeah, well, to take another example of this, the emblem in the Renaissance. I don't know, have you talked about the emblems? All right, let me go back and give a little background on it. In the early Renaissance, they rediscovered Egyptian hieroglyphs. It was never totally unknown, but suddenly a lot of Egyptian art was turning up in Rome and other places, and there was a great excitement around this stuff, and attempts were made to crack this lost code. Why? Because according to the late Neoplatonic philosophers who discussed it and were the sources for their information in the Renaissance, this was a magic form of writing. It was not like an alphabet in which the shapes meant only sounds. It was a magical form of writing in which the shapes were symbols that therefore were imbued with the reality of what they were showing, and that if you could manipulate this writing the way the ancient Egyptian magicians were able to do it, you could have an actual magical influence on the world through writing. This was incredibly exciting idea for people. Not only for artists and writers, but for politicians and rulers as well, because the obelisks were seen as like magic ray, the antennas beaming out magic rays of authority through the magic writing that could be, and they're shaped like sunbeams, like rays. So they're like rays of stone representations of rays that are actually more than representations, they're presentations of the power of this writing. So this was all very exciting, and people were trying to read the hieroglyphs. But since, in fact, they were wrong, the hieroglyphs are, at least in part, about sound, as you probably know, and this was not figured out until the 19th century when Napoleon stole all this loot from Egypt and brought it back, and the Rosetta Stone was, in which there was Egyptian and Greek together, and Champollion finally managed to understand that some of these hieroglyphs were about sound, not about just the object that was being depicted. And he cracked the hieroglyphs, and now we can sort of read Egyptian. But in the Renaissance, it was very frustrating. Either you gave up and said, well, we can't do this, or like my favorite guy, Athanasius Kircher, you waited for divine inspiration to come and tell you what these things meant. And then he wrote these endless books describing, like Oedipus Aegypticus, in which he translated the hieroglyphs according to what he thought they meant, which was generally Neoplatonic mystical philosophy. I mean, he would look at a text which was actually, let's say, a laundry list, and he would, to him it would be like a deep and profound mythological, mystical text, and he translated it. So what came out of this, what I call fortuitous misunderstanding, in other words, they were wrong, but something very important came out of it, and that was the emblem. Because if they couldn't read the Egyptian hieroglyphs, but they thought they understood what the hieroglyphs were doing. Oh, and one of the reasons for this was the discovery of a text called the Hieroglyphica by Horapollo, which was a very late text written by an Egyptian priest in Greek, and rediscovered in Crete, I think, in the 1400s, and immediately translated into Latin. And it was written by an Egyptian priest who sort of knew something about hieroglyphs, but the knowledge by that time had been lost. It was written in the 5th century AD. And the actual ability to read the hieroglyphs had been lost, but still there was some oral tradition had survived, and Horapollo wrote about it. And this text was so tantalizing because he gave the meanings of certain hieroglyphs, or what he thought was the meanings of certain hieroglyphs, but still it was impossible to read the obelisks and the other texts that were coming into Italy with the use of this book. But nevertheless, the idea was, you know what a rebus is? It's a picture. How can I define a rebus? It's, give me an example of a rebus.
I'm bad at this. It's
like
symbols and letters that actually...
Right, it's a simple one, I guess, would be like frustrate, would be F-R-U-S, and then the number 8, stuff like that. It's visual puns. It's you see an image and it gives you the word. So this is what the hieroglyphs should have been in their view. They should have been rebuses. But since they couldn't read them, the next logical step was, well, the heck with it. We'll make our own. We'll make up our own hieroglyphs. And they will be pictures that will be full of symbolic content, not just allegory, but symbol. In other words, there would be a real, although occult, connection between the picture and the object depicted. The symbol is both what it is, and it is what it represents and is at the same time. whereas an allegory simply represents. So these pictures would be linked in the Brunonian sense. The chain, you read this essay about the chains, the De Vinculis in Genere?
Yeah.
The chain is the what Baudelaire calls les correspondances, the correspondences. In other words, the sun, the lion, the diamond, the sunflower, these things are not just allegories of each other. They are actually linked on some deep level of reality, such that by manipulating or understanding one can actually have an influence on the other. And through these chains of correspondences, you can have effects in the world. You can change what is real in some way, because these links are more than just representations, they are presentations. So that's what they thought the image was doing. But in order to make their hieroglyphs, they had to have both the image and the word, because they didn't know how to put them together the way the ancient Egyptians had done according to them. So what they had done was to unpack the hieroglyph, of course they understood it, into picture and image, into picture and caption. So all the emblem books have words in them. I don't think there's, at the very least they have titles. If there's no title, then it's a puzzle for you to figure out, and what you do is translate it into words. So words are always connected to the emblem. And this was, this is what basically then the Warburg, scholars were trying to figure this out in their iconology. Like what did Botticelli mean by the Primavera? Can you translate that picture into an actual message of words or not? Some say yes, some say no. I have a feeling the answer is yes, because I think Botticelli was working very consciously within the emblem tradition. It's not just a pretty picture, or it's not just what he felt. It's saying something. If we've lost the key, then we've lost the key, but it was saying something. Can we recover the key? Yes, very much so, by looking at the emblem books and seeing what these images meant for people at the time. And it became a pictorial language that was understood by lots and lots of people. And that knowledge is there. If we want to try to recover it, we can recover it.
That may be the most useful about our current condition, our current image environment, our current communications environment, where basically we've lost the key. I mean, and we think of,
Well, we have our own pictorial language. When you see a bottle of Coca-Cola, you know what it means.
Right.
There's no question about what it means and what it's doing to your.
It means a better life.
Yeah, and resistance is futile. Oh no, that's Pepsi, right? Yeah, the pictorial, the emblemology of capitalism is a language that we all know.
Right.
Even if there still has to be words, because
well, that's the thing, that in all
the bottle
words
has
for all
Coca-Cola written on
images
it.
are surrounded by words all the time. That's
Yeah.
how we receive them. But we sort of, I forget it. I think that it's just images.
Mm-hmm.
And it's never just images.
No, not even most paintings. Even if they don't have a title, they're titled untitled.
Right.
And you could talk about what untitled means till the cows come home. It's still a word, right? That's why I said, who was the artist you said who didn't want captions with his pictures?
Polka.
Yeah, it's a fascinating idea, and I deeply sympathize with the guy. It was an attempt to get out of that trap,
Yeah.
I don't think you can do it, though. It's a vain dream. So then the other approach to the problem of the image is not iconoclasm, not the smashing of the image, but it's liberation from the image through the image. I think I said this in the article. In other words, we use the emblems not to enchain the masses the way Bruno suggested could be done, but to unchain ourselves, to understand what's being done to us through images, to make our own images that undo that. You know, and I think that's what art is for, myself. Whether it be abstract or representational, that's what it's trying to do. I mean, otherwise, why would we do it? We would make not art then, you know, because that's the only other possibility. I don't see life as being possible without art, except under the conditions that one completely smashes the image. So those are the two ways we can approach this iconostasis. We can either break it down, the way the Cromwellian soldiers broke up the altars and the stained glass windows, or else we can make our own icons, our own sacred images, what's sacred to us. Was that an answer to the question? I've forgotten.
It seems like that relates to your kind of summation of the defensive, or the summation of iconoclasm as being a defense of the imagination against the lie of the image. And I think that in what you just said, with the two options that you're proposing as either smashing the image or creating our own images, in the second, it seems like that would be also in the defense of imagination, because we would have to go into ourselves and figure out a way to picture the world.
Yes, I think either way would be a defense of the imagination, because if you smash the image, what you're doing what the iconoclasts want, which was to sublimate, to make sublime the image by, as I said, the only true image being the Eucharist itself, which is sublime. So you are sublimating, which originally means to make sublime, and only has its Freudian meaning by derivation. They're related, but it's derived. So iconoclasm is a defense of the imagination, but then so is iconolatry. If you understand it, it's also a defense of the imagination, because you don't just passively receive the icon. It's not just something that's making you do something the way an advertisement does. An icon is holy. An advertisement is unholy. An icon is divine. An advertisement is diabolical. The advertisement wants to enchain you, in the Brunonian sense, into buying this piece of shit. The icon wants to unchain you so that you can rise, like sublimate, become sublime, rise up into the divine realm yourself through the image.
And I wonder if images, kind of coming off of what you said about non-representational art and abstract art, I wonder if images aren't irreversibly connected with media and with advertising and the way that we understand that culture, and if maybe now only non-representational images, either through non-representational art or through something like sound and music, or maybe not music but sound, would be a way to engage the imagination that would sublimate.
Well, that's an interesting point. It's an argument. I myself would not want to make that argument, because I feel that representational art still has potential. I'm sure you've heard the word détournement. In other words, even the advertisement itself can be deturned. I think we should make it into an English word. Why not? And become, and be forced into a 180-degree shift, so that it means the opposite of what it was supposed to mean. In other words, don't buy this piece of shit. Whereas, looked at from a certain point of view, the abstract painting is unable to deliver that message, that specific message. Inherent, I guess you could say, implicit in the abstraction would be something like that, but it can't be explicit. unless you do it with a caption. And even that would be perhaps a bit artificial, trying to put an ideological caption on an abstract painting. It might not work so well. But I don't want to give up the possibility that even, if I can use the word surrealism with a small s and not a capital S, that even surrealism still has some potential, even though it was so completely absorbed by the world of advertising and spin doctoring.
Wow, really?
Yeah,
You think it still has
I do.
potential? Wow.
Yeah. Yes, I hold out a torch for. I have a unshakable childhood connection, liking for surrealism, and I can't give it up.
But it would have to look like something completely different now, wouldn't it?
I guess, yeah.
I mean, it would be unrecognizable to us.
It wouldn't look like Max Ernst anymore.
Yeah.
I don't think. But I think it would have to be, in a sense, representational, wouldn't it? In other words, you don't dream, or maybe you do. Maybe you do dream things that look like Rothko's or Pollock's. But I don't. I dream in images. So if you want to say that, that the critique of the image is the defense of the imagination, then we still have to, one way or another, talk about representational images, I think. Or do you not agree? I don't know. I'm willing to discuss this.
The idea, I think that I've been trying to figure out the different types of images that can exist through different types of sensory perception, not just through visual perception. And so I think that certainly a sound or a series of sounds can create an image within the mind.
Absolutely.
And so that would be, but then because it has no tangible object that's its referent, then it would be a purely imaginative or purely, so an image that's created purely within the mind. And then so it's...
You mean it would be purely formal?
Yeah.
As opposed to representational?
As opposed to like this book that I see,
Right.
the sound of the book falling on the ground or its pages turning
Right.
would create a different image.
And the
in my mind.
memory certainly pulls into that if you're going to maintain that you can't wholly come up with a formal image that's not a representation of something you can recall or that exists via your memory or your perception of
Yeah.
like what would a sound translated into a form in your mind be without memory of form?
Yeah, it would have to be a non-visual representation of a memory is what it would turn into.
Well, it sounds like you're onto an interesting. I can't visualize it, but go for it.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll work.
Yeah.
How do you consider memory playing into? I think memory is in Culiano and Bruno's Art of Memory and how he discusses it in Eros and Magic and I would like if you could.
Well, what Frances Yates, bless her soul, even she didn't quite grasp was that the art of memory is not just about memorizing things; it's about magical manipulation of reality. I think the state of Brunonian studies is a disgrace. I want to just add this parenthetically. People should have been building on Frances Yates and going beyond her, standing on her shoulders, so to speak, and instead, all that happens is she gets damned with faint praise and forgotten, and people are not discussing Bruno as a magician. It's embarrassing. We know this. The academics are embarrassed by the whole idea of magic. Now things are changing a little bit. There are actually 3 academic chairs of Hermetic studies in the world now. One in Paris, one in Amsterdam, and I forget where the third one is. So maybe we can look forward to things improving in this respect. But I mean, some of the people, I won't mention any names, who've been writing about Bruno are just really inadequate in my view. They don't get it. They simply don't get it. And the reason why they don't get it is because the whole idea of magic, it's like, if I'm an academic and I'm trying to get tenure and I write a book about Freemasonry, it could be the most scholarly book in the world, saying that Freemasonry had an influence on the American Constitution, which it did. But people say, something unsound about Wilson, interested in Freemasonry. I don't think we better give him tenure. And that's it. That's what happens. That's really what happens. If you write about certain things, you're tainted with those things. If you write about magic, you must be a credulous fool who believes in magic. Well, which I actually am. But the fact is that this stops academics and most serious writers from grasping the value. I mean, Culiano is such a shining exception to what I'm saying, because he's like the only one. And it's no wonder they shot him. He was a dangerous man. He understood that magic can work on many, 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 many levels. And it's not just about mumbo jumbo. It really works, as advertising. How does advertising work? It's a mystery. Nobody can explain. Oh, it's psychological. What does that mean? It's not just psychological, it's magical. There's actually rays beaming out at you. We need to reconsider all these things. And what was the question? Sorry. Just remind
About
me.
memory.
Oh, memory. So the memory theater, the theater of memory, is about if you have all these things in your mind and you manipulate them, you move them around, you can create new things, new ideas out of nothing, or ex nihilo, let's say. And this is a form of magic, and this is what really Raymond Lull and Giordano Bruno and the other memory magi were proposing. Some of them, of course, were just professional public speakers, and they wanted to be able to come up with lots of facts and figures. But on a deeper level, and certainly Bruno was at the deepest level, I think this is what it's about. It's about changing reality.
Do you think it's possible that there have been...
So memory can be magic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I just had like a brainwave. Do you think it's possible that there could have been academic disciplines created sort of in denial of Hermetic studies?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I just read a whole book by this guy Wouter Hanegraaff, who's the professor of Hermetic studies in Amsterdam, and the whole point of this book was that, and he traces this through a long and complicated history, which I won't try to recreate for you. I'm not even sure. Hanegraaff, anyway, look him up. You know who I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
This is a recent book of his in which he's explaining why the academic world has had so much trouble coming to grips with the history of magic. And it has to do essentially with the Protestant attack on the Catholic attempt to integrate what he calls Oriental Platonism with Christian theology. So then the Protestants are so busy tearing down occultism and the Platonic, Oriental Platonism within Catholicism, it becomes a double-edged sword, and the next thing you know, people are tearing down the whole idea of theology and itself as a form of mumbo-jumbo and magic. So you have the Enlightenment. Then you get to the Enlightenment, and the denial of any seriousness to any of this at all, and finally an amnesia about what was in fact the history of human thought. So alchemy, oh pooh, we don't have to pay any attention to alchemy. It never meant anything. It was just superstition. It wasn't the origin of modern science. It wasn't anything. And that becomes then enshrined as academic orthodoxy. That's really a very brief and unfair summation of his book, which I suggest you read if you're interested in elucidating this question for yourself. If you look up Hanegraaff, you'll find this book. You got the book?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Sufism and its relationship to the image, and how you talk about it a little bit in Vex Iconostasis, about how Sufism took the image and united it with the divine. It sublimated really the image, and as a solution to the Islamic, I guess, problem of the image.
Well, in order to understand the dynamics of this situation, you have to understand about the difference between Arabic and Persian culture.
Yeah.
The Arabic culture is inheriting, although they wouldn't like me to say this, perhaps, the Jewish or the technical term would be aniconic
Right.
position. Not anti-iconic, but aniconic. But in fact, when it comes into a dialectical smash up with the rest of the world, then it does become anti-iconic. And this is very much the Arab point of view about Islam. Whereas in Persia, already, because of the strength of the Zoroastrian tradition that's already there, and the artistic tradition that goes with it, is already, a world civilization, not like the Bedouin sheep herders of Arabia. I'm sorry if I'm a little chauvinistic here. I lived in Iran for 10 years. I picked up a lot of their attitudes, but it's true that the image was far more integrated into Persian culture than it was into Arabic culture. That's just true. And mysticism was also deeply ingrained in this culture as a result of their Zoroastrian background and the general tendency of that whole intellectual tradition towards a mystical view of the universe, as opposed to a theological view, let's say, if I can make that distinction. So Sufism, inasmuch as it is heavily influenced by the Persian tradition, I'm not saying it exclusively belongs to the Iranian tradition the way some people do. No, that's not true. Nevertheless, it's heavily implicated. Persian and Sufism, Persian tradition and Sufism are, have an immensely complex relationship and a deep one, so that the whole ethic of the image takes on a different complexion in Iran than it does elsewhere in the Islamic world. This is why the miniature evolved in Iran and not in. I mean, yes, there was some miniature painting going on in Syria in the early Islamic period, and there was also remnants of pre-Islamic iconic tradition that survived for a while in Syria. The famous mosque in Damascus that had all the mosaics that were not destroyed but were allowed to survive from a pre-Islamic period because they didn't show human form. The worst thing of all is to show the human form. The second worst thing is to show any living form, because according to the hadith of the Prophet, on the last day, God will assemble all the artists and poets and say, "Can you bring life to the images that you've created?" And of course, they'll say no, and then He'll throw them into hell. So it's the false image of life is the worst thing that you can do in Islamic. In the theory of Islamic art, but the Persians don't really pay any attention to that. Very little attention. You get to the point where the last remnant of this attitude is that the face of the Prophet is veiled, and everything else is shown. you know. So, and yet there's still not, it doesn't fall into the imitation of reality. For example, there's why is there no perspective in Islamic art? Not because they're too stupid to understand perspective, you know, which is actually what art historians will tell you. It's the last ditch defense against the seductive irreality of the image. In other words, it's saying, look, this is not real. See, it's not. It doesn't have perspective like your vision. It's happening across time rather than space.
It's also why they're miniature as well, right? Because it's absurd. It would be absurd to say it's like, if that's why there's no life size
Yeah.
paintings as well.
Well, actually, even in the 19th century, there are.
Yeah,
There's are you familiar with Iranian art?
a little bit. Yeah.
You know what kahvekhane art is?
Is that nice?
Coffee house art in the 19th century. It's a huge murals that people would travel around with from coffee and go into a coffee house and open it up, and it's like a scroll that shows something happening through time, and he has a pointer, and he starts giving a very artistic rendition of the story. It could be like a t.a.z, like the martyrdom of Hussein. Was a popular subject. Pretty soon everybody's in tears and ordering more tea, you know. So that was practically life size. It got bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
But that's already, you could say, the decadent end of something. And the next thing you know, they're imitating Western art, which happened in India too. When some of the court artists in Mughal India saw paintings with perspective, they were seduced, and they actually then they started doing it. But I think it was resisted for so long, precisely as a kind of spiritual defense against the negative aspects of the image. Perspective in particular. And there are other aspects we could talk about too.
In this essay, there's a sentence that caught my attention where you say the final dualism of spirit and matter must be overcome in the soul. And I was thinking about this idea in theology that man is spirit, he has a soul, and he lives in a body. And I'm kind of interested in knowing if you've thought about this idea that the soul can be a battlefield, kind of for the images, as part of this tripartite system of body, soul, and spirit, and how that can...
That the soul can be a battlefield?
Yeah, can be a battlefield for images, basically. And
wow.
Walking amongst this three-layer thing of body, soul, and spirit.
Well, my personal metaphysics would tend towards a unification of these principles rather than a separation. In other words, I tend to be extremely revisionist about Platonism and distinctly anti-dualist. So that for me, body, soul, spirit are ultimately united. As it says in the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, that which is above is as that which is below, and that which is below is as that which is above, for the accomplishment of the single thing, of the one thing. So, although you're absolutely right in psychological terms, that it is the soul which is the battlefield of the images, there is a way to overcome this. There's a path that overcomes this, that brings, in Islamic terms, peace to the soul. Yeah? And that way is the realization of the oneness of being. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also thinking about how, for instance, in Christian doctrine, the spirit is like the site of perfection, and nothing can happen again in the spirit. It can't be saved again. And the idea of salvation essentially happens, it's going to happen in the soul. while the body is doomed forever or something. And
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not going to be saved until.
Right. If you take this to the extreme that it has been taken, which would be Gnostic dualism, the spirit is untouched and remains perfect. And if we come to comprehend that, then our spirit leaves both the body and the soul behind, and goes back to the real divine principle, which is not the creator of this crap world, you know,
Yeah.
who's a false god. This is a very dramatic religion, but I've always detested it. You know, I've always felt that it's the Gnostic trace within Christianity, which is the problem with Christianity. It's the fact that St. Augustine spent 10 years of his life as a Manichaean and imported all this bad metaphysics into Christianity. And it needs to be swept away. It has the body, soul, and spirit have to be realized as a unity. At least, you know, at the very least, in the Platonic sense of that they're connected as emanations of one another. I would prefer to collapse the whole emanational system into a pantheistic, animistic unity. That's what I do. So that the way out of the battlefield is precisely that. It's the realization that all three of these principles belong to life itself. None of them are removed from life. None of them are greater or lesser than life.
Could that then be helpful in understanding images? In what way would that be helpful?
Again, I would talk about the liberation from the image through the image. That what we're looking for in the image is magic power. In order to overcome the problem of the image. So it's like you can't look for salvation outside of the world. You're giving theological expression now. It's perhaps not the best way to do this, but let's say you can't look for a soteriological or salvific force outside the world. It has to be part of Earth itself, has to be part of life. So the image itself has to be understood in those terms. When we look at an image, we're looking at something which is alive. The emblem is not just an allegory, as I said before. It's symbolic, which means it is actually linked with what it represents. And the effect of that can be magical if we think of it, if we experience it as magical. It can change ourselves, and since when consciousness changes, the world changes, then it changes the world. And it's not, you know, like Mickey Mouse waving a magic wand. It's something much more profound. This is what I think Bruno means by magic. Yeah?
Yeah.
What else?
We were talking on the car ride up here about different ways to find opportunities to experience or participate in your idea of temporary autonomous zones. And one of the ideas was, or one of the questions that I think maybe Michael you raised, was whether or not like being, which maybe you don't have to take credit for if you don't want, was the idea of or the question of whether or not t.a.z could exist within the mind or within like daydreaming. Is that
No, I don't think so.
it has to be.
I've always resisted this idea.
Gotta be social.
It has to be social and it has to be physical.
Okay.
Years ago, Time magazine did an article about a magazine that existed at that time called Mondo 2000. I'm sure you've never heard of it. It's long forgotten. It was a big thing in the 80s. And Time magazine was doing a story on, the weird hipsters of, and in a box they did something on t.a.z, and they said, this is something that can be in cyberspace, which was at that time a new buzzword. And they got it exactly wrong. And when I saw that, I said, oh, thank God they got it wrong. If they had understood my ideas, I would have had to have abandoned them, But thank God Time magazine didn't get it. But this is what I've always felt, is that it's not virtual. It has to be actual in the crudest sense of the word, and it has to be social and it has to be physical. It can't be one person. It could be two. I like to call it the social democracy of two. It could be about Charles Fourier thought it could be 1,620 people. He had that kind of mind, somewhere between 2 and 1,620 seems to be a good figure for it.
Yeah, that's a reasonable range, I suppose.
Yeah. And the reason why it's temporary really is because it's too intense to last. And it can't be institutionalized. As soon as it's institutionalized, what Illich called the paradoxical counterproductivity of monopolistic institutions kicks in, which is that the sociology of institutions says that the institution will make a 180-degree flip, and education will stupefy you, and medicine will make you sick, and transportation won't get you there. And the t.a.z, which is turned into a utopia, becomes oppressive. Utopia itself is perhaps, in a sense, an oppressive idea. There's a dialectic there that we could go into. But this is what I think, that it's a real social event. You can't make it happen. It has to have an element of spontaneity, but you can maximize the conditions for its emergence. You can try to set things up so that it will happen. Take Burning Man Festival, which, by the way, was somewhat influenced by my book, I believe, or so they told me. It seems to work. It seems actually even still to be working, even though I understand there's a lot of non-participants who just come to soak up the experience, and that there's drug agents and God knows what, police go there. But at least in the first few years, they set it up. They maximized the potential for the emergence of a temporary autonomous zone, and it worked with fairly predictable regularity, apparently. I never went, but I heard. So this can be done.
Well, we know that Occupy Wall Street was certainly influenced by your book.
Yeah. I'm proud to say that my book was in the library that was destroyed. I feel really good about that.
No, they saved it, Peter.
In the same... no, but I had other books that were presumably
Yes.
destroyed.
You-
I gave them a whole bunch of stuff. I always thought, Wilhelm Reich's books were burnt at on one of those piers on the Hudson River.
Oh, yeah.
I always thought there should be I'm not exactly sure where it happened, but one could find out. And a brass plaque should be put there saying Wilhelm Reich's books were burned here. And that's why, I feel really good to have had my books burned by the New York Police Department. It's validation for a lifetime's work, It's very good.
There are pictures to prove it.
Yeah, in your book there's a picture, right? Yeah. What were we talking about?
The t.a.z.
Oh.
It's interesting to think of it. I feel like there's a biological corollary in the sense that in the idea of it has to have an aspect of organic creation uncontrolled by human hands. And as I understand in biology, we understand how to basically create the situation that life could arise from, but there's some sort of like magic spark, something
Apparently,
that happens
because
that
they-
we can't recreate or
You know, they've been talking
synthesize.
about doing it for a dog's age, you
Yeah.
know, and they haven't done it. And the futurists keep on predicting it's going to happen any minute, and somehow it never happens.
Yeah.
And they've got all these, you know, complex proteins, and they're shooting. It's like Frankenstein, you know, shooting rays through it, and zilch. It's a mystery. I can't explain it. I'm not going to say that God created it, you know, the world. That would be far too crude a way of looking at things. But there's something deeply mysterious about it. And that mystery resonates through every level of reality.
Yeah.
So that, to me, the t.a.z, which is something that I think is even more important now than when I first thought of it because of the breakdown of the movement of the social, it's kind of all that's left to us as a locus for liberation, for what Rimbaud called the liberté libre, real freedom, you know, free freedom, not the freedom of representational democracy or the freedom of free choice of capitalism, but free freedom. Where else are we going to get it? You know, socialism has given up. Anarchism has no influence, as far as I can make out. The whole world is being taken over by consumer frenzy on the one hand and fundamentalist shit on the other. So the t.a.z sometimes seems to me like the last remnant of the movement of the social, the only possibility. And if it's not permanent, well, too bad. You know, it'd be nice to think of what I used to call the permanent autonomous zone, but
Oh, I just realized that
yes, that's the p.a.z. Right. I also talked about the periodical autonomous zone, which would be like Burning Man, which would be like the festival, where you can maximize the potential for the emergence on a regular basis. And there's a lot of things you can do to make it happen. It might not happen, but there are things you can do that hopefully will make it happen. But it has to happen in a real space with people in physical presence to each other. It can't happen on the internet.
What? Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just thinking from your response about talking about Burning Man and how people go just to soak up the experience, and what you think that the importance is between participation and pure witnessing.
I always thought that, you know, I worked a lot in the avant-garde theater in the 70s, and I always thought that there were two main problems with it. First was the actors, and second was the audience. If you could just get rid of both, you might have something interesting. Now, I know that's a little extreme, but what I mean is, have you ever read Colin Turnbull's book about the pygmies? With the Forest People by Colin Turnbull. You've read it, right? Mm-hmm. The pygmies, when they make music, the whole tribe makes the music together, and they, if I can use the word, channel the spirit of the forest, is what they're doing. And they all get into the spirit. It's a kind of a trance, I suppose, through dance and music, and then they all do this. There is nobody sitting out on the outside, being an audience, being, you know, a hungry bird. They're all in it together, and they're all in each other's presence. And that seems to me to be some kind of a almost perfect art form. And then little by little, you know, you get more and more mediation until you finally reach screenal reality, where you're not in any presence at all. It's pure representation. There's nothing left except the audience. And you're it. And you're in a completely passive position vis-a-vis this cultural transmission. And then, so everything in between those extremes, there's like a spectrum of immediacy, starting with the most immediate, which is the pygmy dance, and the least immediate so far, which is the internet or television. And theater comes somewhere in the middle, right? And recently, not long ago, I heard about a form of theater which strikes me as absolutely ideal. It's Chinese shadow puppet plays, which are put on not for human audiences, but for the spirits. So instead of actors, you have shadows, which are completely two-dimensional, abstract things. And instead of a human audience, you have spirits. So we've gotten rid of both the actors and the audience, and it's almost perfect. And I would love to put on such a play myself. So yeah, that's what in theater you have an audience, but as Peter Brook, whom I worked with years ago, said, there's still audience participation. It's not the crude kind that La Mama and Living Theater do, where the actors take their clothes off and jump in your lap, and make you all embarrassed. But he talked about the invisible golden chain, which was interesting because I didn't know anything about Bruno at the time, and I don't think he did either. But he said that in a good, when theater is working, especially improvisatorial theater, an invisible golden chain between the audience and the performers comes into being and nourishes both. The audience is actually participating, even though it's just sitting there and watching. There's a kind of magical feedback, multiple feedback going on. And I'm perfectly willing to admit that this is true. And that's what's lost when you go to the movies. Movies also have a certain magic, there's no doubt about it, but that particular magic cannot happen in the movies, right? So there's like I say, there's a spectrum. And the more immediate the art form can be, the more interesting it is for me. And I wish I could say that I thought that theater was more successful than, avant-garde theater was more successful than movies, but unfortunately it didn't work out that way, historically. There was always a problem, and as I say, the problem was either the actors or the audience or both. I mean, Brooke was doing this incredibly, improvisatory, spiritual, mystical theater, but who was he doing it with? Professional actors. I mean, they were great, lovely people, but they were professional actors, and always in the back of their mind they were thinking, I better stop doing this soon and get a job on Broadway or I'll be screwed, No, really, they told me that, This is all very well, but what are they thinking about me in the West End now? They're forgetting who I am, So they're professional actors. And there's only so far you can go. Now, Robert Wilson, whom I also worked with, his original solution to this was to not work with professionals. He worked with with painters, non-professionals, waitresses that he picked up in cafes in Wisconsin, kids, and his work that he was doing at that time for me was very, very close to my ideal. It was very, very magical, I thought. But then he gave that idea up and started working with professionals. I don't know why, because I lost contact with him. I don't know, I think probably because it was easier. When you tell a professional what to do, they do it. When you tell a non-professional what to do, they argue with you. So maybe that's why. Maybe that's why he stopped. But for a while there, for a few years there, he was doing something that almost made it, in my view. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I was just wondering about the valuation of participants versus people who are just there to witness.
Yeah, I used to go in the early '90s. I used to go to this arts community called Dreamtime out in West Lima, Wisconsin. And the first time I went there, every year they had what they called a Korobori. And the first one that I went to, I think literally everyone who was there was a participant. So everyone there had something to give. But that was so successful that the next year there were people there who just came to consume. And by the 5th year, there were more consumers than there were performers, and so this split, this schizo split between the performers and the audience had occurred, and I just lost interest in it. I thought that the first year had been magnificent, you know. It's not that all the art was so great. Some of it was pretty pedestrian, but at least everyone there was a giver and not a taker. And it made a wonderful spirit that really, you know, it was a real t.a.z. But as soon as you get the same thing, the Halloween parade in New York was another example that I saw. When I first saw it, I wasn't there at the beginning of it, but I guess maybe in like 1980 or 81 I saw it. And it was going, you know, it would wind through the back streets of Greenwich Village, and people would come out on their fire escapes in costumes and do weird things. And the, you know, artists and gay folk were very creative, and it was all very much for people in the village and other artists from around town and people who liked that kind of thing. Then, one year, shortly thereafter, they changed the route of the parade so that it would go past the major stores in Greenwich Village who were going to sponsor the parade now. They were going to give money to the people who organized the parade. And the whole thing changed. And suddenly there were all these idiots from New Jersey throwing beer cans at the queers, you know. And the whole thing became a horror show. I don't think they do it anymore, do they?
They do.
They do.
It's a pale shadow.
Yeah. As soon as it was commercialized in that way, it was ruined. It's not that everybody participated, but there were more. Let's say when I first saw it, there were more people in costume than not. You know, it was like as if almost everybody was participating, and there was a great spirit to it. So I think there's a real problem about non-participants. I think they drag down the energy level. I often feel the same thing in an art gallery, I'm sorry to say, you know. That there are all these people just consuming the image. What are they giving? Money? Doesn't mean anything. You know? It's a problem.